First of all, it's really amazing to see the amount of energy in the system at ARM and at this meeting. It's just fun to see this whole field evolve with not just the number of people participating in this conference, but the amount of innovation that's happening, and we're seeing it everywhere. Innovation not only obviously on the scientific side, the clinical side, but now increasingly on the commercial side. And I'm going to speak a little bit to that from the bluebird perspective. So thanks to ARM also for pulling together a great meeting as usual. I'm going to be giving some forward-looking statements, so please consult the SEC documents for further information about risks associated with the company. Many of you know that we're anchored in these two concepts of True Blue and Blue Mojo. They sound amorphous, they are, but they're very meaningful to us, and it really represents the two things that we're so committed to as a company. The patient experience and understanding the patient experience deeply so that we really understand what we have to accomplish, and that's not just delivering great science, great clinical data, but now increasingly on the commercial side, understanding how to make their lives better. And then the Blue Mojo is really about the employees and how committed we are to our employee base to make sure that the two work together, that we're really focused on a culture that is deep and rich in both employee development and a corporate development, the company as a whole. I typically like to start out with a story on the True Blue side. I'm going to give you one quick anecdote of how powerful we think these gene therapies, for us, I'm going to give the example of sickle cell, can be, and the plight of the sickle cell patient in particular. I'm paraphrasing something that came from a PI that came into the company to present to a full house of 500 plus employees now, which is kind of crazy to think. We're approaching 700 by year end. We're about 650 right now. But the PI came in, and she was giving a talk on sickle cell patients and how challenged they are. And she showed a chart which identified the pain threshold of these patients and the pain amount of pain that these patients go through when they go through these cycles of acute pain crises. And on a scale of 0 to 10, it showed it built over a very short period of time, and they were up at a 10 and then maintained their level at a 10. So that's interesting, and it's also indicative of these patients and the crises they go through, and maintaining at a 10 through days and sometimes weeks. But that doesn't really bring it to life, right? That's an interesting chart. She brought it to life by talking about this patient coming in, an individual patient, and she asked the audience, how many of you have had Percocet historically to deal with your pain through whatever injury you might have had? And half the room raised their hand. I certainly have experienced that. And she said, how many Percocets, the equivalent of Percocets, you think a sickle cell patient needs coming into the hospital? People said 2, 3, 4, 5. Her answer was 10. 10 Percocets just to get to a point of being able to manage this individual patient's pain. That's typically going to be an IV, not pills. But that really made me take a deep breath and realize how incredibly important it is, not just for sickle cell, but all of the other patient populations we're all trying to treat, to move this field forward and do it in a way that allows them to not have to go through that 10 Percocet experience. So I think you know a little bit about Bluebird. We're a company that is anchored on a big vision and a bold vision. We set out at the beginning of this year. And really it's now pivoting not just to the clinical data and continue to drive clinical data that's meaningful to patients and providers and families, but also now trying to think about how do we broaden the access of these therapies to larger patient populations. And that's really what's represented here. The opportunity to have approval in 2019 on TDT. We have said that we're going to file in the EU this year. And then potentially approvals for our Lenti-D program for CALD and our partner program with Celgene for multiple myeloma in 2020. And then sickle cell, as you may have seen at EHA, is advancing fairly rapidly with the new clinical data. And we're really intending to get some clarity with the agency around what regulatory pathway we can pursue with that program. I'll talk about that in a second. But underpinning this is a pipeline that we've been working on for a number of years now, both internally and through partnerships. And I'll talk briefly about that as well, as it's a big part of who we are and who we're trying to become as we move from a research and clinical-oriented company to now a more fully integrated company, not just in the U.S., but in Europe, U.S., and hopefully beyond that going forward. So this really exemplifies that we're a much more complex organization, certainly than we were 2 years ago or even a year ago. And just to highlight a few things, the number of platforms that are integrated in the company, I think, is fairly uncharacteristic across gene, cell, and gene editing. We've got a number of clinical programs you're familiar with. A lot of you may not know that we're 650 birds across the globe now in 4 major locations, building extensively in Europe, not just in Zug, which is our headquarters, but also throughout Europe in market. 9 active treatment studies ongoing, not a surprise, I don't think. But it's really on the toolbox and the strategic partnership side that we've spent a lot of the last year to 2 years building out capabilities, and then also trying to support, obviously, the commercial side of the business with regard to our strategic partnerships as well. The opportunity to leverage, I think, some of the interesting regulatory designations in terms of speed to market, hopefully. So complex business, but really moving fast. And the great thing about all of us is we're doing this in an ecosystem that is incredibly fortunate for us at this time of the evolution of the industry, whether it be the regulatory side of things and all the different opportunities for engagement with the agencies, whether it be the RMAT designation, which is obviously near and dear to this audience, but also PRIME, the adaptive pathways, which we're taking advantage of, and some of the commentary coming from the agencies about moving these programs more rapidly through the regulatory process, obviously with all the safeguards still in place. But also you've got a rich environment, as we all know, on the approval side of things, and this understates, obviously, the number of approvals that have happened of late. But it's a great environment in which to be one of those companies on the cusp of hopefully some approvals. The pricing and reimbursement, I really think about it, and we think about it as market access. There is a lot to be excited about in this field, in the gene therapy, in terms of the engagement with payers around the value of these different therapies, and we're certainly taking advantage of that. And then lastly, clearly, we've got an industry that really is starting to realize the value of these therapies and the breadth of these therapies going forward across the different platforms and products that are out there. So in the beginning of this year, we really focused the company on these 4 major imperatives. And it's driven by the fact that we've now got late clinical stage programs, again, hopefully approaching filings and approvals, and the desire, most importantly, to build behind that a pipeline that is not just exciting, but is truly continues to be innovative and breakthrough and step forward. So execute and deliver against the core programs for sure. If we don't get that right, doesn't really matter what follows, so that's primary. But as we think about executing, for example, in EU first and then in the US, starting to think about how do we reach scale and how do we have a broader reach to patient populations even beyond those regions. So that's been a big part of how we've been building the company of late. And then continuing to lead the way in the way we've led before, which is never giving up on innovation. Even if you've got a great product, what's the next innovation? Sickle cell is actually a pretty good example where we had a product that looked good in the beginning. We ran into some challenges clinically. We didn't know what was going on. We spent 2 years trying to recover from that, came back with amazing insights. We think we're on a path now to be able to deliver truly transformative care to those patients. Again, all predicated on data continuing to look promising. But we're not resting there. We've got a gene editing program. We've got this technology in Boston Children's, which is an RNA-based approach to sickle cell. So we are continuing to believe to lead the way and do it in a true blue way, as we described before. So how are we doing this? We're doing this by building left and building right, staying focused on delivering on the existing programs, but continuing to invest in both the research side of things and thinking about, obviously, how do we commercialize these in a way that keeps the patient at the center. So that's one thing I think as a field we can't forget as we commercialize these, making sure the patient is at the center, not just of the clinical data and the research, but also the commercial experience that we're going through. The other big component of commercializing these therapies is obviously on the manufacturing side, as it effectively is the product. The cells are the product. And so making sure we're doing this in a scalable way, and that's why we've made the investments, not only in our manufacturing plant in North Carolina, but also the major strategic partnerships we've forged over the last several years. One example of the opposite side of that spectrum of trying to commercialize these products is our Regeneron deal, and I just wanted to highlight that for a quick second. We're very excited about this collaboration along with the others, but this is the most recent. It really does bring, we feel, some of the best-in-class science together from Regeneron and bluebird. You can see some of those theses here. Regeneron has an incredible capability, we believe, in particular as it relates to not only fully human antibodies, but the identification of target-specific antibodies in a way that we think is very unique and does set us up with them in a collaboration that we think will generate some pretty interesting results and INDs. The intent is to drive INDs through this program and leverage some of the other technologies we have access to internally and externally. You can see some of those here. You can see the deal. It was predominantly a 50-50 deal across the board where we're really committing wholesale to next-generation programs. And here are the clinical data, I think, that underpin all of this. I've talked a lot about how we're trying to become a more commercially oriented company and balancing all the R&D with the commercial. But these are the data you've seen. I'm not going to go through them in any level of detail. Presented TDT data at EHA this year, presented ALD data at a different conference earlier this year. Again, sickle cell data at EHA this year. You can see the data summaries here, and then you know our program with Celgene in multiple myeloma around BB2121 and the follow-on project 21217 and the ongoing KARMA trial with Celgene, which is intended to be a pivotal trial. Very quickly, just focused in on thalassemia, as that's what's really in our radar screen right now in terms of focus on delivering. Here are the 4 major clinical trials ongoing, the first 3 of which will form the basis for an EU filing and subsequent, hopefully, commercial launch. These are the data that underpin that in the terms of the 207 trial, which is the new manufacturing process. And you've seen these data before, showing that 7 out of 80 patients are producing not just greater than 7 grams per deciliter of gene therapy product, but also getting to near normal levels of hemoglobin for these patients, which 2 or 3 years ago was almost unthinkable, even from bluebird's perspective. So it's really exciting, and the basis upon which we continue to be excited about the commercial merits of that. We continue to have very good production over time and stable T87Q levels, which is important as we talk about the durability of these therapies. This is the registration strategy, which I already referenced, conditional approval hopefully in the EU, along the lines of leveraging 204, 205, and 207 data, and subsequent filings in the US, leveraging the 207 and 212 trials. And here are the milestones for the year. A lot of data has been disclosed throughout the year at ASCO, at EHA, but more is coming at ASH. And obviously for sickle cell, one of the things I know that the investor community is looking to is how we're thinking about the registration strategy there. So we're thinking about how to disclose that through the end of this year. And then in multiple myeloma, really thinking about how do we move into earlier lines of therapy, which we've been articulate about with Celgene and how we plan to do that starting this year, which has already occurred. So it really comes down to the employee base and the focus on this concept of staying true to the patient, not just now in the clinical and research world, but now increasingly on the commercial side. So thank you very much.